give me permission to share my screen?
Yes, Nutsa, please.
Yes, just a second.
Nutsa, can you turn off your mic? Yes, sir, because there is echo from your place.
From where? From me?
No, from one of the rooms. Now it's okay. You are the host now.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah, I don't want it up. Or
No, but I just want to test it.
okay.
So you see it, right?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yes, we see it.
Cool. Then I will stop for now. Then share it when Peter is ready. Oh, so since I'm the host, I can change it.
Okay, we are just testing right now the voice in our call for our audience, and we would start in 5 minutes approximately.
You have a
Okay.
live audience?
Yes, we have the audience that are watching from the side auditorium of this room.
Oh, I thought it was only online.
Yes, it's online as well, but also there is a group of students that are watching our
Okay.
talk for today.
And at what time is it now? It's 7 p.m.
It's 7:50 right now.
7:50.
Yes,
Oh.
here for us.
Okay. Well, we're
For
ready.
you, I guess it's 10, right?
I'm at what? It's
11.
For you, it's 10 a.m., right?
No, it's 11.
Okay, it's 11.
In England, it's 5 hours difference is whatever, 4, I think.
Yes.
4 in England and 7 in Tbilisi, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we are in live already. So people already joined us. We have live on Biennial's Facebook pages and also YouTube page. So I think we can start slowly.
4 in England and 7 in
Okay.
Tbilisi, right?
So should I start? What do you think, Sandro?
Yes, I think we can start
You have
now.
to introduce this.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here on behalf of Metaform team and participants of our workshop of critical analysis of Georgian architecture. The international workshop is held in the frames of the second edition of Tbilisi Architecture Biennial, which is conceived under the name What Do We Have in Common, and proposed to take a closer look at the notion of togetherness in our increasingly individualized and fragmented societies. It's a great honor for us to be part of this big family this year and find out what do we have in common. Very briefly on the workshop, we are a team of 4 architects, Salome Gugunava, Nutsa Lomsadze, Alexandre Gacechiladze, and Nodar Panchiani. Sandro, თუ შეგიძლია რომ გააგრძელო დანარჩენი ტექსტი, რაც ჩვენ ვილაპარაკეთ.
Sorry, I will continue because there is a problem with Nodar's voice. So idea of the workshop has been born by looking at and discussing last 2 centuries of history of Georgian architecture. We believe that huge knowledge has been accumulated over the period, which needs to be rediscovered and rethought. The workshop has hosts prominent and keynote international architects, urban thinkers, architectural theorists, and artists to reflect the concept of formal reading in the discourse of architectural theory. Today, our very special guest is Mr. Peter Eisenman. We would like to express our huge gratitude to him personally and also to Mr. Lorenzo degli Esposti, who very kindly connected us and brought our workshop to the higher level on global discussion and knowledge sharing processes. I'm sure Mr. Peter Eisenman doesn't need special introduction. He is internationally recognized architect, educator, and theorist, and he has been shaping and influencing modern discourse in architecture for a very long time. His award-winning large-scale housing and urban design projects, innovative facilities for educational institutions, series of inventive private houses, and many of built and unbuilt projects have been and are sources of inspiration and learning for generations of architects. Mr. Eisenman is founder of Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, an international think tank for architecture in New York. His academic career also includes teaching at Cambridge, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Ohio State Universities, and Cooper Union. Mr. Peter Eisenman is also an author. In fact, his work has been huge inspiration and learning instrument for us, curators of the workshop, especially books Palladio Virtual, 10 Canonical Buildings, and his work on Giuseppe Terrani, Transformations, Decompositions, Critiques. He is very well known and respected in Georgian architectural society, and I am sure everyone is eager to listen to him. We have audience in Tbilisi, Georgia, as well as online. So without any further ado, we will now give a word to Mr. Peter Eisenman. Please.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be this close and this far away. I think it would be difficult to be able to travel this distance. In any case, I want to do two things tonight. I want, first of all, to talk about the title of my lecture, which is Lateness, which is a book that, along with my colleague, Elisa Turbe, who teaches with me and is an architect and a former student, we published a book called Lateness with the Princeton Architectural Press. It's a little book, red cover. You can get it on Amazon very easily. It's a theoretical treatise about what we think is possible in today's world. And the second part will be a project in Milano that Lorenzo Degli Esposti and myself finished last year, but which may exhibit ideas of lateness that will be talked about. So I'm going to talk for a little while, 20 minutes, read something from the book, show some images for about 20 minutes, and discuss questions and answers from the audience. So with that as an outline, I'm going to begin a text that I have written. Over 2 years ago, I wrote in the magazine Flat Out, a critical review from Chicago and Chicago Circle School of Architecture. I wrote a review of Mario Carpo's then new book, The Second Digital Turn. That critique took the form of a singular idea about complexity and resistance in architecture. The point I was making was that because the second digital turn could process big data faster than ever before, so fast, in fact, then what could superficially be seen as complexity would in fact turn out to be nothing more than simplicity. The second digital turn was characterized by Carpo as a and existing not as things, but as gaps, as absences between things, could suggest a project for architecture. However, a problem remained, which had to do with the relationship between the processes that produce architecture and the way architecture is read. Now, some 2 years later, there is another idea which could be aimed at the hegemony of the digital. That idea concerns a different conception of time. Most advances in the project of modern and modern architecture have been located in the time of the avant-garde, the canon of the new, and the projective of more ideal futures. The digital being only the latest of these many attempts over the past 100 years. Therefore, Elisa Turby and I published a small book by the Princeton University Press called Lateness, which is an indirect attack on the digital. Thus, I want to argue today that lateness represents a potential challenge to the digital avant-garde. Unlike most attempts to speak of the late, such as late modern, late style, etc., lateness carries a unique condition of time which could destabilize the virus of the new. There are two usually understood meanings of the adjective late. The first use of the term refers to a late style as an individual's work of art at an old age, and the changes that occur because of this age. Picasso's late style is a good example of these changes. The second use is used to describe lateness by a period style, such as late Baroque or late modern. However, the use of the term that concerns us here is neither of these two meanings. Rather, it is from Theodor Adorno's use of the term lateness, as in Beethoven's late work, to distinguish it from the subjectivity of a late personal style. Adorno proposes a redefinition of the term late as an agency of the formal as opposed to the idea of self-expression. Lateness in this context becomes a resistance to self-expression. Basically, what this means that the relationship between form and time must be rethought. This emphasis on the formal as opposed to the citational produces a temporal ambiguity, causing time to become discontinuous. This conception of time differs from the dialectical framework of the 20th century in architecture that relied on a rejection of what came before, an attitude that was prevalent both in the modern era's pronouncements of a break with the past, as well as the subsequent postmodern rejection of that break. By the end of the century, it seemed that the digital would produce a different temporality, as its emergent forms seemed to have no history at all. However, it has since become evident that the digital is a recapitulation of a techno-zeitgeist in which the limits of form are determined by the boundaries of the technology itself. For example, in parametric design, form is determined by numerical inputs. At the same time, the idealization of technological progress clouds the perception of its imposed formal limits. Excuse me. The digital does not transcend the dialectical frame of the 20th century, but rather reverts to the idealization of the present that characterized the modern. Against this background, lateness presents an alternative view of form in the form and in time, because the integrity of form is preserved at the scale of specific conventions, while at the same time inherited notions of how one convention might relate to another are challenged or reinvented. Lateness is therefore neither an explicit break with history nor an overt return to the past. Lateness has no ties to any particular style, nor does it operate as a style in itself. Rather, it manifests itself as an interruption to linear time, a gap, a caesura, and as such, its form must be contingent its outward appearance dependent on the historical context in which certain conventions are dominant and others are suppressed. A study of lateness, which is what we're proposing in our small book, offers the possibility of uncovering a critical mode in which the invention of new form is no longer the stated goal of a critical architecture. Instead, a different critical mode might emerge in questions about the relationship between form and kind proposed in the term lateness. What is different today and what I thought 2 years ago is the relationship to time. The parts are no longer situated in the new. Rather, the interruption in linear time, the kaisurai, which create the parts, are no longer of the new, in the time present, but look both forward and backward. When form is contingent, a different critical mode might emerge in questions about the relationship between form and kind. The late comes into being, when a convention is temporarily displaced, causing the relationship between parts within an architectural work to be reinvented. The contingency of late form is both temporal and spatial. The spatial, propelled by digital tools and their capacity to generate unprecedented deformations, remains aligned to the conditions of the present through an idealization of technology. In contrast, the decontextualized conventions that characterize the late destabilize ideological, stylistic, and historical narratives. Basically, what I'm saying and what I want to show today is that within the purview of the late, the effects of the digital are irrelevant. And that's an important point. What is relevant is the placing of architectural conventions in a fractured temporal context where their former narratives are suspended, rendered meaningless in the contingency of their gaps. And so, having written this and taught this for several years, Elisa and myself decided that we thought we should publish it. And then Lorenzo Degli Esposti presented us with a chance to see if such an idea could be used in a design process in a built building. So that theoretical inscription, which has characterized the last few years of my production, is somewhat apparent in the pictures that we're going to show. The project that Lorenzo and myself and our team produced, which opened last fall. And it exists in Milan, and it exists in a way outside of the framework of the modern aesthetic. So I want to show the pictures. Okay, can we have the first, Erdem? Hello. Okay, I don't know if I'll be able to point to anything, but you can see the building in its context, and it's limited in height. There are height restrictions. There are all kinds of restrictions, which you will see as we develop the project. We didn't start out with a curved project. We started out with a perimeter block. The whole idea was to see if we could get the maximum number of units for the developer, and also be conscious of environmental concerns. Because of that, in fact, we did not have any corridors. We had through apartments. Every apartment has two external advantages. so that there's a through circulation of air, which really limits the use of air conditioning in the summer and early fall. But those are things that were really important to us, in addition to this idea of presenting a building as late. Next, please. The map shows the location of the project. It's about a mile east of the Duomo, the Cathedral of Milan, and the Piazza del Duomo. It's in a residential neighborhood. Up to the top right of the map would be the architecture school in Milan, the Politecnico. Okay, next. This I want to show you because it brings up the idea of lateness. The building that I'm showing you is Giovanni Muzio's Ca' Brutta, a very famous building in Milan of 1922. I would call Ca' Brutta one of the most important late projects that exist in contemporary architecture. Why is it late? Because in an era where the modern was the avant-garde project, this used a three-layer typology that is typical of the Milanese palazzi, and that is a ground floor, as you can see here, a piano nobile in the darker stone, and an attic story in the light stone. Let me see if my cursor is working. I can see, let me do this. Okay. So what I'm saying is that we have the lower story here in the lighter stone, the ground floor. Then we have, in a sense, a piano nobile in the brown layer, and then an attic story here. So there's a tripartite typology of Milan, and actually in most of Italy, this tripartite housing type. And so what Muzio does, instead of using the modern idiom, the white and frame building, which are many examples in Milano, he uses this bearing wall and the typology of the Milanese palazzo, but he does it in a smooth, what I would call smooth form. He rounds the corner. And so this is both a typology of the new, because there are not many rounded corner buildings in Milano, and conservative. So it's the new and the old brought together, decontextualized from the context of the avant-garde of the new. And so I call Muzio, and it's a really important work, a late work. And then you will see how Muzio's late work relates to what we were doing in the Carlo Erba project. Next, please. The building, what's interesting, you can see the perimeter block, but this is the Muzio part here, and across the street, so that you have a galleria type space between these two, which it makes it very important in terms of the urban project. And of course, you can see how the tripartite masonry work continues on the opposite side. So you get the rounded corner, and then you get the regular block, and then the block is filled in as a kind of perimeter block. And so you get the idea of the old typology with a new form in a new context. And it's very important that one understands that there are these two different typologies. One, the typology of the old, and the typology of the perimeter block, which is old, and then the turning the corner. So Ca' Brutta is one of the most important buildings. I've never ever looked at it in the way that I had. It was always, well, he was a fascist architect. But no, actually, he was interested in what we're calling here lateness, not late style, but lateness, something outside of his own personal ambition. Next, please. So we originally thought the building, the diagram on the left, we would do a perimeter block, and it had an existing building which we had to keep. You can see the existing building here. Okay. The trouble with the perimeter block was that it had exceeded the regulations that we were allowed to build. So that allowed us to get all of the units we needed, but we couldn't build that building because of zoning. Next, please. So you see, we had to take back from the street edge this amount of space, and we had to push it in from the edge in order not to violate the height restrictions. So that was the first change. So now we have two buildings, which is obviously not as what is desired. We have these leftover conditions because of the perimeter block that we started with. Then we had to push back at the corner, as you can see here, and that caused another movement, and we started to have a slab block here and a kind of L-shaped block on the other side. Again, this having two buildings, two necessary securities, was not where we wanted to go. Next. So what we did was to join these two buildings into one. And this shape gave us the same number of units as the two buildings did, but was able to get over certain environmental problems. Next. And then we decided, well, since we have this crazy crank building, let's make it a curved shape. I've never done a curved shape before, but the continuity of the curved shape started to give us this feeling of the old new, let's say, the idea that Muzio had. So we were now referring back, which was a late idea, now the curved building, referring to the curved building, which was at that time an avant-garde idea. Next. And then we did what Muzio had done, is we made a tripartite idea. In other words, a base, piano nobile, and an attic story of 2 and 3 floor units, urban villas that we call them. And so we immediately started to work with the 3-part typology, again, the old. And so we now have totally late things without the dialogue with the contemporary, which is the next level that we would go to. Next, please. And you could then we shifted off so that we could have both front and back exposure. We have, this is the front side, and this is the back side. And the idea of front and back is also from a traditional architectural typology. Next, please. And what we wanted to do was to have no corridors. So we had 6 cores, circulation cores, which had an apartment on each side, and there were no cores. So you got out, no corridors. You got out on your floor, and you either had apartment A or apartment B, apartment C and apartment D, which allowed for through apartments. That was really important environmentally to what we were trying to do. Let me get my crayon back. And then we put the cores in the building, and you can see the modulation that occurred. Very interesting modulation of A, B, B. The A and then the B was 1 bay, 2 bays, and 3 bays. So there was a rhythm, a staccato rhythm, which I thought was, we thought, I should say, was really important. Next, please. And here you can see the building from the plan, the roofscape from above and how it sets in. And of course, what was important to us is there's a garden which we open onto and continue. So there is this idea that the context, in a sense, pushes the building into its position. The garden idea pushes the building into this front and back idea. We still have not got the dialogue, the play between two different ideas of building, the old and the new. Next. And you can see the apartments. Every apartment has a balcony, so there's fresh air, and each apartment is through levels so that you get all the way through to the bedrooms in the rear. It's a very concise plan, and as far as a development project, it was really useful for the developers. Next, you can see the terraces. Next, the section, there were 2 levels or 3 levels of parking underneath. We had to have one, every apartment had to have a half a parking space. So that was important to the project. And you can see the garden here and the setback of the upper story, or the set forward of the upper story, which you'll see in the elevations. Next. Yeah, go to the next. Okay, so here you can really see the tripartite. You get the Roman travertine on the base. You have the, depending on how you want to call it, the piano nobile here, which is 1 level apartments, or this band here. So there's a 2nd level band, and then there's a 3rd level up above, which are the urban villas, which are 3 and 2 stories. What is now important is the frame. The modernist frame, it comes into play as an overlay on the top story. So you have a regular base, a piano nobile, and the frame building. So the building is both a frame structure in the modernist idiom, of which people like Tarani and Lingieri, the Casa Corso Sempione, Casa Ruscici, and other buildings by Tarani and modern architects. So there is the idea of the frame building. And so the top half, let's say, of the building is frame, and the bottom is masonry base. And that gives you this dialogue between the old and the new. There's not just one way to do it. It's not old and it's neither new. And we had hoped that intersection of these different materials and even structural elements would produce what one would call a late work, not a late personal style, not a late national or local style, but late unto itself, the kind of late and lateness that Adorno was talking about. Next, please. And you can see this is the backside. And what happens is that the frame on the backside pushes into the wall surface, so that the idea of front and back still pertains even with the frame. There's a traditional notion that a front of a building in Italy, a palazzo, is a flat surface, and the rear is an articulated surface. And this is what occurs here. Here, the surface is articulated because the frame is let in and sets itself up as a reveal. As you can see, it becomes a shadow line across the back side. And on the front, that same shadow line becomes a positive element, pushing outward, so that the front says something different than the back. And to me, all architecture has to have this notion that there is a front and back. It's not just a line. So the difference between this and, say, Hilbersheimer, you did a line for a building, had a front and a back that were the same. This says, no, there are two lines. One is the front and one is the back. And so you get a back line. So we're emphasizing two distinct typologies, one from the frame typology from the modern, and the bearing wall tripartite typology of traditional Italian urban villas. And so that becomes the dialogue of the building. That's neither new nor old, but both. Next. And you can see how the frame takes over on where the building is on top of the existing building, office building, which we brought into the whole idea of the design. And you can see it as it comes around the front, the tripartite idea. Next, please. And you can see again, this is the front piece here. And the base is this Roman travertine. It's basically glass on the that piano nobile, basically glass, and then white marble up above. So not only is it in the physical form and the openings, but in the material itself. So we've got stone, we've got white marble, and we've got white frame as the three components of the building. Next, please. And you can see how the garden, this is the garden across the street, comes through and into the space and reacts, therefore, contextually to the space. And it's very clear, very carefully detailed. Lorenzo's office did a great job detailing the project. And you can feel the density of the surface, the many different layers of construction and organization that especially when the grid shifts off, and you can see here is a back layer and a front layer of the grid, and you see how the window slips out of alignment with the frame structure. Again, all of this carefully calculated. And it could be seen to be, it's not an avant-garde work. It's not a postmodern return to classical architecture. It's something between the two. And that between is what we believe is lateness, and what is a way of dealing with today, as opposed to being avant-garde, because we're not in an avant-garde movement. And it's not historicizing, because I don't believe we are in a historical moment. And so I believe that this building talks about the possibility of how one might conceivably articulate in a design process the idea of lateness. Next, please. And you can see the other end and the opening of the frame. It's very important to understand. People ask, where is the frame here? Why wasn't that element? Because that element was outside the zoning envelope allowable in terms of height restrictions. So we had to take that element and move it over to here. And so there's a disruption in the overall envelope of the building, where we had to deny the continuity of the building in this area due to the fact that it was outside the zoning requirements. That's how tenuous the articulation of this building proved to be. Next, please. And you can see in the front, the garden and the Piano Nobile. We're at the Piano Nobile with a long terrace, which has been a really good point of sale for the developer. I mean, to do something like this with a developer, I think was really important to see the possibility of this kind of project. Next. And the level of scalar complexity to the openings, like the differentiation in the openings, the mullions and divisions within the glass are very clearly articulated. Next. A shot at dusk where the lighting reinforces the Piano Nobile, the Roman travertine at the base, and the framed structure up above. And so it's a really clear indication of the tripartite material and illuminated area of the building. Next. The same illumination in the evening. Here's one of the units on the Piano Nobile with the long terrace out here and the living room and the storage wall over here. And these are really nice units. And I believe that most of them sold, and the people seem quite happy with their quarters. Next, please. And here is the another view of the storage wall here and the balcony here, and the TV and work table or dining table over here. Next. And you can see the organization. There is this service wall, which is here and provides a buffer, as it were, between the living dining area and the kitchen over here to the bedroom area behind, which we thought was really important, that the wall just didn't come right onto the living quarters, but there was a sort of space between. Could be a dressing room, could be any number of things for the 3 or 4 bedrooms, depending on how we wanted to subdivide it. It could be divided so that this room here was off of the hall, could have been a 1-bedroom or a studio suite. Lots of flexibility in the potential of the units. And of course, then you have the other unit, the unit that's possible here. So the plans move and have a lot of flexibility. Next. And these are recent shots that we took with a drone. They are really, you begin to realize how important that the roof surface is and the design of the roof, because the drone really gives you another view. It's like worm's eye perspectives on the computer. This is a bird's eye perspective from a drone. Next, please. And the same. Next. And there's the roof and the garden. And you begin to see the whole idea of the project as it comes to be. Okay, there's the last view from the corner. I would propose to the organizers that we have a few minutes. I left about 15 minutes for questions and comments from the students or the architects. This is the first time I've encountered Georgian architects, and and maybe it's the first time you've encountered somebody that presents a theory and then tries to support that theory with an actual building. Difficult to do. So please, if you guys have some questions or other students or architects, I'd try to answer them.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was an amazing lecture, and indeed to see how this theory really reflects into your building somehow also answered many of my questions. And now please, we can hear questions online as well, and also from the audience.
Well, you are going to get the questions, and you're going to have to tell me what they are.
Yeah, yes. I'm waiting for questions now. So.
I would have a question, if I may. Do you hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay. In the essay, The Futility of Objects, written in 1984, you write, and I'm gonna quote now, "The history is not continuous. It's made up of presences and absences. The absences are the ruptures between the continuity which has ended and the next one which has not yet begun. In this sense, in the paradigm of 20th century architecture, there are a series of ruptures in the local and global scales. What would you say? How could the time solve and kind of end this kind of rupture that occurs in the contemporary architecture?"
Well, first of all, I'm surprised how close to what I'm thinking today, that 1984, but you have to remember that's 34 years ago. It's half a generation, and to tell me I would have to defend that idea, I'm not thinking that. What I am defending today is the notion of the rupture in the narrative sequence, that I no longer believe there's a continuity between the modern, the postmodern, the digital, etc. What I believe is interesting is the ruptures that we have not looked at, the voids, the caesura, as I call it, and that's really the important thing, is to take away from form its content as a continuity, as a narrative. That's number one. Number two, the modernist dialectic, the dialectic that was put forward by Hegel and Kant, that had to do with thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There was always a synthesis. There was always plus, minus, synthesis, which created what I would consider the idealized version of the modern. The modern was progressive, it was avant-garde, it was ideal. And why it never achieved its condition of value is because it produced the same idealization that was inherent in the 19th century, which the modern, in other cases, as in film and literature and art and music, overcame. In other words, but in architecture, the idealization of the, and this comes all the way from Alberti, the part to whole relationship, which he first states in 1462 or somewhere around that time, is still with us. In other words, we believe that there is an inevitable relationship between the part to whole. That is called the synthetic dialectic. There is another aspect of dialectic that can be seen as a tripartite thing, that is thing, nothing, or being, no being, becoming. And what I'm working with is the non-synthetic idea of the dialectic as a tripartite organization, where the former synthesis is not a synthesis, but it's a state of becoming, okay? With Elisa Torbe, my colleague, and myself are teaching a studio at Yale this year, talking about third space. And this is an idea that the philosopher Homi Bhabha and Edward Soya, the geologist, put forward about 20 years ago. It's a late idea, okay? It's not new, it's a late idea, but the talk about a non-dialectical or a trialectic third space. And I ask you all to look at Soja's work about third space and Homi Bhabha's work on hybridity, a hybrid, different from what Alberti was talking about. If there's any building that's a hybrid, is what I just showed. A building that's part classical, part normal typology, part modern, part etc. And to me, these are the kinds of things that are important. If you look at Alberti's church, Tempio Malatestiana in Rimini, it's an existing Gothic church which he rebuilds so we can have this dialogue, and he puts a Renaissance facade wrapper around it, the Tempio Malatestiana. So there is this hybrid quality already built in to Alberti in the 15th century. I'm merely saying that we've got to relook at these things because the dialectic leads only to idealization. And what we cannot, again, try is the idealized future. We need to think of the present not as idealized, but as the complexity that we are faced today, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in the United States. And I can tell you the situation in the United States is really complex, and it's going to get more so in the next 10 days. So I hope that, you can go back through the tape of this thing and catch all the references, but they're important to follow up because we need an architecture that is possibly dealing with the notion of the hybrid, of the third space, of the late. And that's what I tried as an introduction for the students and architects in Georgia. I hope that it opens some ideas that all of us share.
Indeed, thank you so much. So we are getting some other questions from auditorium, from online auditorium. and I would try to kind of ask you without,
Right.
do
You
you hear me?
It's okay. Nice. Okay. So,
I can't understand that.
Uh,
Our sound is very bad. Nusa, can you write the question and we will read it?
So, in the discourse of time, if we consider the contemporary uncertainty of architecture, what could we have in common as architects in future and for future?
Well, first of all, we have an environmental problem that is worldwide, a global problem of global warming, of the questions of diversity, which we have as, and many of the countries have. Certainly what's going on between Afghanistan and Armenia is a question of diversity. So these are external problems that every discipline, whether it's music, literature, etc., architecture has to face it in its own way. And what I'm assuming is that the question of carbon form, for example, how do we get over this concern? So we all have common problems, much more common worldwide than we had before. And I don't think there's a regional style or a local style. I think that it comes out of our own history. So if we were going to build something in Georgia, for example, there's a tradition in Georgia that comes out of Iran, out of Persia, out of many, and then in a contemporary sense, out of the Soviet Union. There are a lot of things out of Turkey, and then the struggle between the Muslim and the Christian, or the two turns, the Shias and the other group in the Muslim world. So we're talking about local problems and general problems, and those have to be understood in terms of architecture. We did a project in Turkey, the Yanakapi project, which was a museum, and we based it on a grid organization that came from Hagia Sophia that had been overlooked, and a rhythm that was in the Hagia Sophia going all the way back to 10th and 11th century. And we based this project so nobody had seen a project like it, and produced an unusual situation. The same with using an organization in Carlo Erba of a local situation. Every time you have both the local and the general or global. And so we have common problems. They're not very different. And problem of concrete in Tbilisi is just the same problem as concrete in New York or Tokyo. So get with it, guys. That doesn't mean we're going to cut down all the trees, etc. And I want to say one last thing, because we haven't talked about the pandemic. There have been pandemics throughout history, and architecture has changed and moved, etc., not because of the pandemic. And the world didn't change in 1918, 19, the last pandemic, let's say. And so we're going to get through this. We're going to wear our masks. We're going to spatially distance. And architecture is going to still have problems facing its normal problems. We're not going to radicalize architecture because of the pandemic. It's never happened in the past, and it won't happen today. I mean, for example, in 1527, the northern Christians sacked Rome because they were against the authority of Rome. Up until 1527, everybody knew Rome was the central situation of the world. when Rome was no longer the center, art, architecture, music went on, philosophy went on. And so the same thing is going to happen after the pandemic, for sure. We'll get a vaccine. People will ultimately take it, and we'll keep moving. And I believe that we're in a great moment in time because the old systems of wealth and hierarchy are not working. They're not working in the United States. They're not working. They've divided the United States. They're not working necessarily in many of the European countries. The rise of right-wing dictatorial ideas have resurfaced, as they always will, and we will deal with them. So I'm very hopeful that we will still have common problems and common solutions.
Thank you so much. Would you ask the question?
Firstly, thank you for the very interesting lecture. My question is regarding the very interesting part of the building that, as you call it, it is not old, neither new. It's grid elements. And my question is, as in a music, there is a pause, a space, or an empty moment, maybe time for you to realize. My question is, can one assume the space in the grid as a possibility, or can one see it as a future development, maybe, or it's just a space that is left to our imagination, to everyone?
No, let's go back. I teach a Renaissance course. Before 1462, there was no mention of space in an architectural text. Alberti was the first person in his De Re Architectura of architecture that mentioned spatium, all right? And this was because what he was dealing with was something other than homogeneous space. He was proposing this hybrid notion between Gothic and the New, okay? And he was proposing a thing called heterogeneous space. I think the difference when we have homogeneous space and heterogeneous space, we have a big difference. Corbu, in his 5 points, talked about the free plan. The free plan was nothing but homogeneous space, okay? There were columns, not walls. So what happens when we get Aldo Rossi and Bob Venturi and the postmodernists start putting walls back in space, and we have heterogeneous space? And so the play between heterogeneous and homogeneous has always been a dialogue. We don't speak a lot about it. So I'm thinking, to answer your question, I'm really interested in heterogeneous space. I'm interested in the density of space as opposed to sparsity. For example, in modern painting, there used to be, in Renaissance painting, a density at the center. All the action happened in the center. So the modern, to distinguish that, pushed everything to the edge, and the density was in what was called edge stress. And the same thing happened in architecture, that the density went to the periphery. What I'm interested in is how one organizes the density of heterogeneous space, not homogeneous space, and how, given the material limitations and spatial needs, let's say, we can do that. And I believe space, the void. And I, did I think a book collection written into the void. I believe my work is writing in the void as heterogeneous space. When you conceive of a heterogeneous space and you look then at what Alberti was doing and what Corbu and let's say Aldo Rossi, the difference, you begin to see evolutionary ideas. So I think a study of the past will help us to understand going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is a next question from Martina from Rome that asks the question formulated like this. Formal analysis is a potential tool to use and see the architectural form from the point of view of its formulation. What can formal analysis and how can formal analysis be an active tool to be implemented in the designing of a building object?
I believe in the idea, not only hybrid, but the part of the hybrid that is called precedent. So I believe that the computer programs like Rhino and 3D Studio Max and others start with zero, nothing to do with architecture. And I believe what we need to do is to infuse into the computer programs that we have, the platforms that we have, architectural precedent. And to me, the study of precedent, the study of typologies, the study of different attitudes toward form and space, you can't go either today or forward without that kind of knowledge. You just can't invent. There's no such thing as something new. And so to me, with my students, have spent a lot of time in my own work studying precedent, and I teach precedent. In other words, if we have a housing project to do, I want to know, is it a 9 square or is it a 4 square? Is it a rotation? Is it a density or sparse? Is it homogeneous or not? I want to know all of the precedents. And I have books like Lattaroi's Edifice de Rome Moderne, a big 3-volume book of all the great plans of historical Rome, for example. To me, you can't go to Rome and invent a new plan. You got to go either from the basilicas, the triumphal arches, history. Rome has an incredible history of heterogeneous space. Don't worry about what's happening in the world. Take a look at the history of Rome and know that. I teach that history. I teach the history of Milan. I teach the history of the United States. So precedent to me is the significant factor in hybridity, not copying the past, but using it as part of a solution to make the hybrid. Without precedent, there may be no hybrid, just new. So you take the glass of the new and you put half a cup of precedent in and you shake it well and you've got hybridity.
Thank you. Can I ask how much time do we have? Because there are many questions and everyone is interested.
Well, I mean, there could be questions that are less valuable than others. You have to determine. We can continue for 10 minutes or so. It's up to you.
Okay. So there was one question from Levan Kalandarishvili, who is interested how far can architect go, and if there is a need for regulations, for instance, in historic cities, or it shall be free and everything shall be allowed. Like that was the question.
Well, first of all, not everything can be allowed. Everybody can't just say, I'm going to build what I want to build on my land, and because you have somebody next to you. So the idea of society works with built form as well. They're building regulations, they're dealing with urban form and other things that come into play. No, there's no free zone where you can do what you want. You do within the zone what works for you and the greater good. How you balance that is where, you know, the law comes in, moral law, and the social law. And social behavior is all about the spaces of architecture control social behavior. And I would like to think that the buildings I have done and continue to do have something to do with the expression of social behavior within limits. I think that's clear.
I also have one question, my personal, if I may. So in your many writings and also lectures, you mentioned your trip with Colin Rowe when you went to Italy, studying different buildings and analyzing them. And this somehow was a step to start to really understand close reading and what does it mean. So I have a question: how can architect really, without Colin Rowe and maybe without you, by himself study close reading, and how can he reach this step of close reading, and how can we improve ourselves as an architects, especially when it is such an accelerated reality we live in, and it's so hard to stop for a moment and observe stuff.
Well, first of all, there are plenty of books to read. I would say that Colin Rowe is only one of many. Manfredo Tafuri, Rainer Banham. There were great critics, Rudolf Wittkover in the 20th century, that we can learn from. And you don't need to have to study directly. Then you have to go and look at buildings. I mean, I stood in front of a Palladian villa that Colin Rowe took me to on our first trip in 1961. And he said, stand in front of that house until you can tell me something which you cannot see. And to me, the whole idea of the presence of something you can't see, an absence, is what architecture and what space and heterogeneous space is about. And what I learned from Colin Rowe was, don't just look at what you can see. Oh, there's a beam, there's a wall, there's a floor or a ceiling. Look at what is left out when you were explaining the other part of the world, which is the void. And I quickly learned how to look for the void. And you can read and look and find those things. Anybody can do it. You don't need to have a Colin Rowe as a teacher, perhaps better not, or a Peter Eisenman, or a Manfredo Tafuri. The best teachers are the books and the buildings themselves. Everybody who's interested, there are plenty of books, maybe not all translated into Georgian, but enough available that you should be able to continue. Next.
There is also one question in online. During an increasing globalization, how can we taken lost identities to enhance local architecture without being seen as old or historicist, instead as an enhancement of international architecture?
That's a really good question. If I knew the answer to that, I would be working right now, not giving a lecture. I give a lecture to try and understand. That's the question I'm proposing. How can we do something that's both local and general that enhances the worldview of being? I would argue the following. Architecture has always been a symbol of the culture, how it feels about itself. When you have good architecture, I mean, in the 19th century, in little towns in America, the post office, the library, the town hall were all architected buildings. And there are these late 19th century ideas of architecture in local towns in America were wonderful. You look at those same towns today, no concern for the post office, no concern for the library, no concern for the town, just junk. And so there has to be a rethinking of the value of architecture in our culture. And it shouldn't be given over to developer culture. It should be part of the moral fabric of all the each community to be concerned about public building. And when we can restore that, the idea that architecture is important and it can promote, let's say, the health of the general culture, then we will have done something. Right now, we don't have that.
Okay.
Could we have one more question and then we should wrap up?
Yes. There is one more question from online session 2. George Maisuradze asks you the question. I have listened your lecture the last time in Milan, and you mentioned about a project, the large project in Tbilisi. According to you, it should be the biggest one in your career. Could you please provide more information regarding this project?
Maybe the organizers have more information on the project. There is a moratorium on travel. There's a moratorium on projects, as far as I can understand, because of COVID. And so there's nothing I can say that is known or unknown. Nothing has happened. We are hoping that in the next 5 to 6 months, we will be able to do a project. But I'm not the one organizing it. I'm just the person at the other end. And my appearance at this Biennale has nothing to do with the project that we were talking about. So anyway, tell him to wait. The question.
Okay.
But guys, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about architecture. I love sharing it. And when we get back to traveling, I hope to see lots of Georgian students coming to see projects in the United States. And I hope to think that American students and architects will also go to Georgia, because I know there are some wonderful things in the history of Georgia that is really important for all of us to learn. So thank you for this beginning of or the midway through an international exchange. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot for this amazing lecture. And Tbilisi Architectural Biennial, I would like to invite you for also next Biennial, if it will be able also in this situation of pandemic, and if it's over, to invite you and to host you in Georgia and to meet you in person. Would be really amazing. And thanks to everyone who was listening to us.
Good. Thank you. We'll see you in 2 years.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to leave.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.